So the topic of our presentation today is titled Backdooring the Lottery and Other Security Tales from Gaming. So the overview of a talk, we'll go through some introductions, just first who we are so you get some context, what has happened since 2011, and why that date's important to me is it's the last time I was here speaking at DEF CON about iGaming security issues. Give a brief historical overview of some attacks and how the focus has switched from the physical to now more on the logical side. And then probably what's most interesting, and what Evan's going to spend a lot of time talking about, is the Eddie Tipton case, how we discovered how he rigged the lottery, what Evan did to reverse engineer the code, etc. If time allows, we'll talk a little bit about the recent Russian slot attacks that, they were in Wired magazine recently, and the report is coming out with another story in a couple weeks, and then we'll try to wrap everything up. So first, one slide about who my company is, since they paid for us, Senate International. Look us up. Always looking to talk to people. Who I am. My name's Gus Fritschie. I'm a CTO of Senate International, and about 5 years ago, after my presentation on iGaming, I transitioned a significant portion of our practice into the gaming sector because I just found it more interesting than doing the government work that we had been focusing on. And now I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to do and the client base we have going across from lotteries to tribal casinos, corporate casinos, daily fantasy sports, etc.
Hey, so I'm Evan. I work for Gus. I live in the what? Oh.
Work with me.
Yeah, I work with Gus. So I live in DC. I have like a Linux distro. It's a small one. I do like reverse engineering and stuff. And in my free time, I hike and climb, and I live in a van too. So here's my van. It's but yeah, his.
So Evan limited me to only 2 memes. So this is one of them. So this is not going to be a super technical talk, but then again, it's Sunday, the last day of DEF CON. I'm sure there's been a ton of great, highly technical talks. It's more of a story talk, but Evan definitely does get into the details with the code, which I think, those of you who are interested in that subject should find pretty interesting. So what has happened since 2011? First, just by a show of hands, how many people saw my last one on iGaming security? I was just curious who attended. So a handful of people. So the good news for all of us online poker players is we got paid back our money from the sites that got shut down for the most part. So that's obviously a good thing. But what we have seen happen is not a lot of movement in iGaming. The green illustrates the states where iGaming is legal. So really we only have 3, Nevada, Delaware, and New Jersey. The yellow is pending legislation. Why I find this slide interesting is, even though it's a small number, it shows that the attack footprint is expanding. And I think if I don't have a slide, but if I showed a slide of where it shows where land-based casinos are legal, you would also see that expanding. We have tons of states even 5 years ago that have casinos that didn't used to have casinos. So we see, the potential attack footprint expanding. Is there a question?
What is iGaming?
Sorry, iGaming, online poker, online slots, gambling basically online. The Caesars and other companies, they like to call it gaming because gambling has a bad sound to it.
Thank you.
So this sector has not been immune to security incidents, just like any other sector that you read about in the news. I'm not going to talk about any of these in any detail. I just picked a random sampling of some of the breaches that have been disclosed. And of course, as you know, there's plenty other breaches that occur that never get disclosed, that we don't hear about. So this is obviously an area that needs to be secured. And I think when it comes to the public's the trust and the integrity of gaming is extremely important, because without that you don't really have a solid business model. With the Las Vegas Sands, I do find this interesting. This happened in December of 2014. If you didn't read about it, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but this occurred to arguably the world's most profitable gaming organization. They make millions and millions of dollars. And at this point in time, where the breach occurred, they had a very small IT security staff. haven't done any work with Las Vegas Sands, so I can't speak to their size of their staff now, but I understand it's increased a lot, and they put a lot more money into securing those environments. But the way this breach occurred was, just to show you how easy it was just a development server that was stood up on the perimeter that they didn't know about, or they knew about, but it was used as a foothold, and then they pivoted inside and they just ran havoc, destroying data. And it could have been a lot worse if they were more sophisticated and did not look to be destructive. So history. Let's get into some of the early attacks against slot machines. Not going to spend really too much time, so I want Evan to get to his piece, which I think is more interesting. But obviously in the earlier days, we had physical attacks with fake coins, yo-yoing with a coin on a string, pulling it back out, attacks against the banknote validators when those started getting installed. And then we have Tommy Carmichael here, who came up with a couple of inventions, or devices, I should say, that allowed him to commit fraud with a monkey paw, which he was sort of able to use to jam up there and release the coin hopper. And then, of course, with the light wand, which manipulated the sensors and allowed the money to come out of the machine without being won. So these, we saw these early attacks were more physical in nature. And another physical attack that we saw that happened in 1980, and my partner in the lottery sector, Herb Delahanty, wrote about this in his book, and it was also made into a movie. I don't think a very good one, but it was there. And they weighted the balls, so they weighted the 6s and 4s, and this obviously was able to happen because you had collusion between multiple parties. Obviously, people realized pretty quickly that it was a fraud, and no one got paid out. Even the illegal books knew that prior to the lottery even admitting it. So we had these physical attacks against slot machines and other forms of gaming. And then we see a transition to attacks on the logical side. And I think when you start seeing these stories, you'll start seeing how they tie together to what Eddie Tipton did in the MUSL Hot Lotto RNG fraud case. So some of you may be aware of Ron Harris, but he worked for the Nevada Gaming Control Board, and his responsibility was basically to perform audits of the gaming software and platforms. And one of his responsibilities was to audit the EPROMs in the slot machines and make sure that they were correct. But what he did was, instead of auditing them, he reprogrammed them so that when a certain sequence was pushed on the slot machines or a certain number of coins were entered, it would pay out a winnings. And I spoke to Rex Carlson, who was the director of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, and he said that they really don't know how much money he actually made from this, because he really he didn't get caught initially because of this. He got caught because he turned his attention to keno. And this is where it sort of parallels what Mr. Tipton did in the Hot Lotto case. Is, since he had access, of course, to the source code, he found a flaw in the pseudo-random number generator, and then he wrote a program that allowed him to predict what the winning keno number was. So he went to Bally's in Atlantic City, and with an accomplice, they won it, I think, on the first time that he played the numbers. And they probably could have got away with it, but they just had such poor planning as far as what they were going to do after they won. So this, of course, raised suspicion, and the authorities performed investigation. Then they went back and looked at the other work that he was performing. So what we see is individuals with trust who were trusted to perform these reviews and had access to these devices. And this will parallel what happened with Eddie. And one last example from a technical perspective, and I talked about this in my last presentation, but this was from the Absolute Poker Ultimate Bet super user scandal, where the owner of the site, I guess I should say alleged, because it was never actually 100% proven, but he had convinced one of the programmers that he needed a backdoor into the program so he could see players' hole cards, because he thought his whole idea was that there was cheating and only he could figure out if they were really cheating. But he proceeded to use this backdoor in the poker software to illegally win about $20 million from players. And this graph shows the individual, one of the accounts, and you can see that he's way off there as far as the norm from a winning percentage. So once again, we have examples from Ron Harris with the Keno, being able to access the source code and find weaknesses. Here we have an example placing another backdoor in a system, allowing cheat and fraud to occur in the poker. So now I'm going to turn it over to Evan, where he's going to get into the current events and what I think is the most interesting topic of this talk.
All right, cool. So this is my first talk, by the way. So in case you guys aren't familiar with how the lottery works, there's individual state lotteries, and each lottery manages itself. But there's something called MUSL, which is like an organization that oversees all the state lotteries. Well, most of them. So back in 2005, was it? Or was it 2004? It doesn't matter. So a while back, this guy named Eddie Tipton got a job at MUSL to write an RNG. So some of the state lotteries use computer RNGs to draw the numbers. Others use balls out of hats and stuff like that. Well, not actually hats, but yeah. So he got a job to write an RNG, and pretty much immediately he rigged it because obviously he wanted to make money. And they weren't paying him very much. Yep. So here's a couple of other faces involved in this. Tommy Tipton is his brother. He was involved in it. He helped cash out tickets. Robert Rhodes also helped cash out tickets. He was a friend of his. And then Rob Sand is the attorney general in charge of the case. All right. So in 2010, Eddie went into a gas station in Iowa and purchased a ticket for a lottery game. He waited a whole year to claim the ticket, which was pretty suspicious. And then also he used a mysterious company incorporated in Belize, and he went through an attorney to try to cash out the ticket. So that was obviously extremely suspicious, and lottery security caught wind of that and decided to do an investigation into it. They also refused to give them the money until they completed the investigation, and because they refused to give their identities, which is possibly illegal. So they withdrew their claim to the prize because they, I'm assuming, did not want to get caught. Let's see here. And apparently they also received a tip from somebody that Tipton was the person in the video. I actually think I know who that was, but yeah. So they started a full investigation, which involved the FBI and stuff too. And they determined that it was him that purchased the ticket. And because he worked for the lottery, he was banned from playing the lottery. And they kind of used circumstantial evidence to convict him, but they convicted him before they knew how he actually rigged the lottery, or that he did for sure. Yes, let's see. He was sentenced to 10 years of prison. He was out on bond, or bail, pending appeal, for a good year. He actually just pled guilty pretty recently. This should be 2017, but yeah. And here's a quick timeline of events. So he was hired in 2003 at MUSL. And the first known case of fraud was in 2005. There could have been earlier cases though, because it was rigged in 2004, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting about the timeline here, if you look at where it says that the Colorado lottery fraud was Wisconsin lottery fraud, Kansas lottery fraud, do you see a pattern there? Yeah, they're all on the same date. And that's what Evan will talk about when it gets into how his code actually worked and how it allowed him to predict what the winning numbers were going to be.
Yeah, and also this is just known cases of fraud. There will probably be more, especially since we found a third date in the code itself, which there were no known cases of fraud for. So let's see here. Oh, yeah, he wants to.
No, I just wanted to also a couple gaps just in the story. As Evan mentioned, he was convicted initially on a charge on really circumstantial evidence. I mean, they had the video footage from the store, which when you think about it, he really made a big mistake because in the other cases of fraud, he actually never bought the tickets himself. He had his accomplices, his brother or Robert Rhodes, buying the ticket. But in this case, he actually went and bought the ticket himself. And perhaps that's because the prize value was so large that he just didn't feel comfortable having someone else buy the winning tickets. And he actually went to a convenience store that had audio and also video surveillance. So there was other stores that he could have gone to that wouldn't have had the video or the audio. And that's really the audio was what convicted him because his voice is very distinctive and they were able to prove it that way. Of course, he felt and his lawyers felt it was circumstantial evidence and they did appeal it. And during that appeal process, that's when we were able to get a hold of the Wisconsin lottery RNG, which Evan will talk about and what he did. But how do you go about rigging a lottery? And this is my second and last meme, so I was only allowed two. But obviously, you become a lottery developer, write code, and have your friends buy the winning numbers. It's that easy. And luckily, for the first time, we have video surveillance of Eddie Tipton actually performing the programming. Now Evan will tell you how he really did it.
Yeah, so I already kind of went over this part, but so basically what he did, he worked for MUSL. So not all the lotteries, all the state lotteries use the RNG. Some of them use third-party RNGs, and others use like machines that just like throw balls up in the air and they come back down and stuff like that, which is what lotteries should do, by the way. Should not use computers to generate numbers, but it's better business for us. While I worked there, so they have like a supervised build process. So he got code past that process, which made the numbers predictable in 3 days, with other conditions as well. And the binaries and source code were certified by a major testing lab, but the way he did it, it wouldn't have mattered unless you really went in depth and checked the binary against the source code and stuff like that. He also had access to the computer images too, which he could have rigged. He could have used like a rootkit or something simpler to change the numbers as well. So even if he wasn't the one writing the code, he could have rigged the lottery as well. In 2016, we were contracted to perform imaging of one of the RNGs. And we were actually given permission to review the images at some point, and I was asked to try to figure out how he did it. Because at this point, nobody had any idea how he actually did it. He didn't seem smart enough to use a rootkit. So when he was convicted, they assumed that he used a rootkit to change the numbers because they didn't find anything in the code. Apparently, they didn't find the binary to be malicious in any way. And I find it kind of questionable how they analyzed that. But yeah. So I decided that since he was the one writing the RNG itself, that I would just look at the binaries and compare them to the code. So I didn't actually have the code initially, so I just started like just going through the binaries and just reverse engineering them. So there were a few binaries, like the main executable, some libraries and stuff like that. So the most interesting binary was the one that actually contained like the RNG itself. So that was actually the first binary that I looked at, or started looking at. And this is pretty much what I just said. So I was skimming through all the functions in the binary, and one of them caught my eye pretty much immediately. And at this point, I knew that all the winnings, all the known cases of fraud, were on certain dates. So this one, I saw it had a bunch of date functions right at the top. So I was like, that's probably it. Like, I saw no other reason for them to use date stuff. So I started obviously reverse engineering it, and I saw pretty much immediately that it was referencing those specific dates, the 2 dates that we knew, and a third date as well. So I reverse engineered it, and I figured out exactly what it was doing and how it was seeding the RNG and everything like that. So also it was at the end of the binary, which is pretty suspicious because it looks like somebody like tacked on that function at the very end of like a file. And eventually we got the source code for the RNG, and we saw that that function wasn't in there. There are 25 functions in the source code and 26 in the binary, as you can see. But yep, yep, that's about it. That's how he did it. I can go into details on that real quick. So basically, each time a number was drawn, this function was called, and it would receive the RNG with predictable values on certain days of the year. It also had to be like a Wednesday and I think it's supposed to be Sunday, Wednesday or a Sunday. And here's just like the code of his function. And so he actually seeded the RNG off a bunch of values from the computer. I'm not really sure why he did that. He could have used anything really. He used like the computer name, and he like added it up and like threw that into the seed along with like the values from the game and everything. He kind of made it more complicated than necessary, which made him have to buy more tickets than necessary. Like in some cases, he bought multiple tickets because he wasn't sure what the values would be. Yeah. And so here's why certification did not work. So it was certified by one of the major testing labs. And their testing process was to run the output of the RNG through a bunch of statistical tests, which is great to ensure that results are unbiased, but it doesn't really catch anybody rigging it. They performed an audit of the source code, but the source code he compiled is obviously different, and he was able to slip that past the supervised build process pretty easily. So that's questionable. And here's how he could have done it better too. He rigged it on only 3 days a year, which made it pretty easy to identify the winnings. If you rig it on every single day of the year, it'd be extremely difficult to identify the winnings. Because what they did, like what the investigators did, was they knew that he was using like certain dates. So they just went through all those dates, and they looked at all the winnings, and they looked at the ones that were most suspicious, and they followed those as leads. So obviously, if you rig the lottery, definitely do every single day of the year. And yeah. And also, he could have made the method of rigging it more discrete. He could have used a rootkit and changed the numbers in memory, and that would have been much more discrete than like having it in the binary. Because what we do now is we check updates to the RNGs and compare them to the source code with like bindiff, or if it's in Java, I wrote a custom tool for that. So that we can catch updates, like if anybody tries to, like if a vendor tries to like pass a backdoor into like the update, we can catch that pretty easily. So how can this be prevented? Source code should undergo in-depth third-party reviews. I think supervised builds are important too, as an additional layer. But for updates, if you're just like, if you have a binary and you're not concerned about the system image, it's pretty easy to check those with like bindiff and make sure they're not malicious after reviewing the source code. Because what we do is we compile the source code and we compare it to like the actual binary you get. But there's another issue with like the system image too, where these guys are building the system image and that's not supervised at all. So they could obviously slip something in, and it's pretty difficult to supervise that entire process. And you can't check the image. You can't be certain of finding anything in there. Yep, here you are. That's about it.
No, thanks, Evan. I think you covered that very well. When you think about it, he actually, had a pretty good idea because, once he got this qvrng.dll file certified by the testing labs, and, once again, the testing labs, supposedly, and I know they do now because we do, review the source code line by line, but, and they were supposed to, watch them compile the codes because if they end up hashing those binaries, so in some way, we're not completely sure, he was able to get the testing lab to certify that this code was valid, and then he had it on all these boxes, and that never changed. He would make modifications perhaps to qv.exe, to the executable, but he never ever had to modify the DLL. So actually what was interesting when we reviewed some of the more recent MUSL RNGs, and you have to remember, he started this process in 2003. He wasn't, this fraud case didn't happen until 2011. He wasn't, convicted until 2015. That's a lot of time going on for him to make modifications. And, as Evan mentioned, there are other commercial RNGs in the lottery sector. But some of the state lotteries, their whole mission is to give back to education or whatever, is written into the law. And, so they're very frugal with their money, and they didn't want to, pay, 200,000, whatever for a RNG. So they would pay MUSL at a much lower cost. So you had all these RNGs being used in other states. And when we reviewed some of the other ones in other states, at least the ones where we could get the images to, it was interesting because the executable was not calling the qvrng.dll. Correct, Evan? Yeah, the newer one. So somewhere along the line, I think he got scared or nervous, perhaps after his jackpot win, and switched to code so people wouldn't even look at that qvrng.dll. And maybe his plan was once things die down, he could just call it again in the future.
Well, so I think he left the binary on there when he updated. I think he just left it on there, to be honest. There's been some speculation that he had left it on there to switch back in the future, but I think he just left it on there like when he updated, he never deleted it. Be honest.
Yeah, there's different theories for why he did that. But in the end, I think it's a case of where we see breakdowns in a couple different areas, and probably the most obvious and basic is that the separation of duties. Here you had somebody who was the director of security of MUSL, who was a lead programmer. He had physical access to the boxes. He had everything. And to give MUSL credit now, they have completely revamped their entire process, and their operational management and technical controls are 100 times better than they were when this fraud was committed. So we can probably definitely go into more detail and talk later about the Tipton case outside. If you guys have specific questions for Evan, get into the weeds of it. Let's just check on time here. We got plenty of time. I felt we rushed because I was nervous about the video issues in the beginning. So the Russian slot machine hacking, and this sort of ties everything back to the present. We talked about Ron Harris back in the mid-1990s. We have the iGaming, the Ultimate Bet, Absolute Poker, fraud. We have this Tipton case, and here we have this Russian slot machine hacking, which is a very good article, which I'm sure most of you read because it was widely tweeted, at least in my Twitter feed. And I give a link to it there. And also, Willie Allison of World Game Protection Conference, he was also quoted in that article. And World Game Protection Conference is a conference here in Vegas in the December timeframe that pretty much focuses on physical security, but he's broadened it, and he has some inside information as far as how this fraud occurred as well. But basically, just to rehash the story and tie it back in 2009, when Putin made gambling illegal in Russia, there was this flood of slot machines on the black market. So some of them, or a lot of them, were sold to other casinos, but some found their ways into the hands of the Russian mafia, and they ended up reverse engineering. Well, I'll just get to that piece of it, what they did. But in 2011, some casinos in Europe were noticing some suspicious payouts, and then in 2014 in Missouri, they noticed really unusual and high payouts on some particular slot machines. So they started investigating this, and this is where you have compensated controls and other pieces actually worked to end up detecting the fraud. It was they had to go back to the physical surveillance cameras and tie this all together. But these individuals, they came back and they were later arrested in Missouri, and then some more were arrested in Singapore last year. But what did they do? They reverse engineered, similar to what Evan did with the code, but they reverse engineered the software the binary on the slot machines, and they found a weakness in the PRNG. So then what they would, what the guys would do is they would take a video of a certain number of spins. 20, I say 24 there, but it varied. And that data was transmitted back to their comrades back in Russia, where they were using very high powerful computers to process this data, send it back to them. They had an app on their phone which would then vibrate a couple seconds, milliseconds before they were supposed to hit the button. And it wasn't always successful, but it did result in a much higher payout. So this is an example where we have a case where there was a weakness in the computer programming in the RNG. This wasn't built on purpose. It was just a mistake that the developers made. This vulnerability, impacted a particular vendor, Aristocrat, I believe, on their older versions. But the claim now is, and I think not to steal the reporter's thunder, but that they claim to have working code for even more modern slot machines, and they're threatening to release this code to the general public. They were trying to blackmail Aristocrat, I believe, but so far that hasn't worked. But it'll be interesting to read the story when that comes out. So we talked about some issues here in a lot of different sectors. What can casinos and operators do to better protect themselves? I think it's no different than any other industry, from healthcare to banking. We get caught in this trap of compliance. We got to be compliant. We got to be compliant. We got to be compliant. And we waste a lot of money on paper doing that. But we have to understand, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, that compliance does not equal security. And when I first got into working with casinos and other gaming operators, I went in there thinking, wow, these guys are going to be super secure. You see all the movies, Ocean's 11, they got all this surveillance cameras, and they are very good from a physical perspective for the most part. But, quite honestly, they really are lacking in the technical security controls. But that's really no different than any other sector. And they're doing a lot more now to improve themselves. They're being proactive. I'm working with several. I know other firms are working with them. So they really are taking it to heart to improve their security and protect their players' data. More money needs to be spent on information security, and also the operators need to start asking the game manufacturers, how is your system secure? What controls do you have in place? And I'll give you an example. We were working with a casino organization, and we were doing a security assessment, just a basic vulnerability assessment, and realized that from the corporate network we could actually get to the slot machines and touch the interface card in the slot machines. And when I brought that up to the director of IT's attention, because I was curious, I was like, should you be able to do this? It didn't seem right. He was like, well, let me fire off a note to, I'm not going to say the gaming manufacturer's name. And they came back, oh no, this should, the only thing that these need to talk to is a player tracking database. It doesn't need to, it should be firewalled off. So you have, operators who are trusting their vendors to do the installations, and they're not, sometimes not doing it correctly. And then also questioning what other controls do you have in place, as far as the SDLC process, with this code. Obviously, these huge organizations, they're not like MUSL. They don't have one guy writing the code. They have hundreds. But how do we trust that code is secure? Especially when we're dealing with a lot of the gaming operators do, a large amount of offshore development. What are the controls in place? Luckily, we do have gaming regulations with security components. When New Jersey, the second state to legalize iGaming, they came out with very comprehensive security controls, at least more comprehensive than what was in the unregulated industries. If you recall, at that time, there was really no security controls in place. And to date, New Jersey is very proud of the fact that they haven't had a security incident or a breach, or that their controls are working effectively. Maryland, for example, their gaming commission requires their land-based operators to undergo an annual security assessment. Once again, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a step in the right direction to have these these compliance regulations in place. And then, of course, we have our regular regulatory compliance standards, PCI, et cetera. But as the last bullet says there, often it's left up to the operator to determine the level of security that is implemented. There's not strict guidelines. Even when it comes to New Jersey and the testing, it's sort of left up to us working with the operator to determine how deep we dive. And as you can guess, probably a lot of that comes to funding and budget for those operators. So conclusion, while regulated iGaming has added additional controls, there's still room for improvement both on the operators and regulators. And this goes to brick and mortar casinos as well, and also to the lottery sector. In my opinion, as I mentioned, I think one of the key risks is in the code. And that's what concerns me most, and I think this applies to all forms of online gambling and also brick and mortar. It would be, in my opinion, pretty easy for something to be added to one of these iGaming sites that could allow fraud to be committed. It's happened in the past. I think it's going to happen again, and it's very important for the regulators and operators to work together. And the last point is, as you saw on the slide with the map, while it's still small with iGaming, it's growing. Daily Fantasy Sports is here, as you can't watch an NFL football game without seeing DraftKings or FanDuel advertising. It's become more widely accepted. Sports betting is looks like it could become legal in other states besides Nevada. No longer is gaming focused on Nevada and Atlantic City. It's across the entire United States, and as it becomes, as it expands, that attack footprint expands and the opportunity expands for crime and fraud to be committed. So that's what we have. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'm sorry for some of the technical delays, and we rushed a little bit in the beginning when we probably didn't have to. But we would love to speak with any of you outside if you have any specific questions, especially for Evan. I know he went through those code slides pretty quickly, but he can definitely go into more detail as far as how that code worked, the various functions, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you for attending, and enjoy the last day at DEF CON.